Due to popular demand, I am now revisiting the Empire tier list to make the biggest and most comprehensive tier list of the Empire in light of their new changes. And you will have noticed, well, fans be happy to hear they've gone from a flimsy frontline backing some mid-missile units to being an absolute powerhouse with the steel faith and gunpowder they're known for, with a much stronger heavy cavalry arm now. Their meta has shifted and justifies a new video, so please consider liking and subbing because boy did this one take a while to make. We're going to include some basics, some in-depth strategy, absolutely everything, so hopefully there's something for newcomers and veterans of the Empire to also maybe give you a refresher and really differentiate the different units and what they do offer, because the unit cards do not tell the whole story. As usual, we're moving from tier 1 to tier 5 to demonstrate the story of your campaign, and I'll be talking about more towards the end the individual factions and their special units. The only difference will be Karl Franz's state troops. Yes, they're accessible by the other factions, but really as Karl Franz, he's the only one where it's really worth doubling down to get them, and I'll talk about each unit typically in its grouping, but most importantly from the beginning to the end of the campaign to really show the relevance. And the tiers we have are F Banished, and this tier really only exists because it gives the outperformed units a bad name if we were to mix them, and outperformed is simply outperformed in the face of better options because there's better tools, or it struggles for relevancy at the time you get it. Now C is usable. This unit is perfectly fine. Most of these you could go a whole campaign without using, but they can be a key utility at a certain point in the game. But B tier is solid. This isn't a bad word. If the whole roster was in this, you have a very, very well-rounded roster. These units will be great even a tier or two above where you get them. A tier is excellent. And just remember, you don't need to spam any of these units. None of these are a mass production rating. This could be a unit that you have 18 of in a stack, or only one, which just requires that much utility, but this is an excellent unit that stands head and shoulders above, and something you should look to employ or at least consider in all of your campaigns. Now, I've gotten rid of the overpowered tier. The reason being is CA have just done an excellent job in rebalancing the game. There's a few nitpicks, but I'm sure they will get washed out in the upcoming patches, but overall the game is in a really, really healthy state, and increasingly so, thanks to just really diligent patching, which makes these tier lists so much more interesting to do. It's not about spamming Unit A all the way through the campaign and then getting tier 5 unit and spamming that. There are different units for different stages of the game, and you should be able to compare this to that of the other factions to give you an idea of where this faction is strongest, and those units that are exemplifying this strength are the S tier legendary units, and these, if used properly, can be absolutely decisive, and they're generally quite famous in online discourse because they are that good. Please feel free to add strategies or disagree with any placings in the comments below. I often find in these lists the justification is worth more than the ranking itself, but if you do disagree, please, I want to hear from you. Give me a bit of context as to how, because I do try to consider other viewpoints other than my own when making these, so they are well rounded and will apply to the most players possible. The Empire of Man are the most popular faction, and it's easy to understand why. They are basically the most relatable of any of the factions. Their regular citizens are among the least oppressed, and let's talk about them with the infantry. They blend culture, tradesmanship, and military service on the weekends, so they aren't career soldiers, but like everything in the Empire, they are relatively well rounded, and you can train them to become great. And with the right support units and skills, they can become more than great. It might be a surprise to see the first infantryman in D outperformed, and that is the basic Empire Spearman. You don't need a barracks to get this, but boy should you get a barracks unless you are in a crisis situation where you need to rapidly raise a lord and some troops to either fight off a rebellion or an incoming army, and you don't have another choice. You should always go for the barracks based units as opposed to this. Getting a barracks slaps a shield on this unit and it becomes a hell of a lot better, bolstering the melee defense and gives them shielding against 1/3 of all missiles. This allows them to be a perfect front row unit, screening enemy missiles, but especially on the rear flanks of your army. Stretching them out and keeping them still will allow them to brace a charge, reflect a little bit of damage back, and especially against cavalry, deal anti-large damage. Anti-large is a horse or bigger, providing a boost to melee attack. See my 8 unit types guide to get your head around the different types of units, but in a nutshell, they are defensive infantrymen, so you want the highest possible melee defense on them, and with 42, this is more than adequate. 30 armor, their part-time nature starts to show itself with only 100 mass, quite weak for a spearman unit, showing whilst they like to joust with their mates, they're probably showing up to group training on the weekends a little hungover. Whilst not looking amazing on the surface of it, but having heroes in your army that can use their auras to bolster their leadership and their melee stats, there is a very fair argument to say you will have heroes in your armies, therefore put them up to A tier. But honestly, there are definitely better spearmen in the game, and I can't justify an A rating, but they stay in B alongside the humble swordsman. With less melee defense, I'm sure many are thinking, why would you use this as your defensive unit? But here's the thing, it almost sits halfway between a defensive and offensive infantryman. With 14 charge bonus and a tiny bit more armor piercing, against regular infantry, this will do much better. Every unit has a base 1 in 3 chance to hit, plus their melee attack, subtract the enemy melee defense. This means the shielded spearmen are great for holding the line and much harder to hit. However, unless against large units, they're not really hitting a lot. Conversely, having a unit of swordsmen in the front and center of your formation, where they are likely to encounter other infantry, means they are going to trade off much better, dealing far more hits and likely winning that engagement. When they do win, they actually have a charge bonus, they'll get some benefit charging into the flank of an engaged spearmen. I would always prioritize shielded spearmen on the front and rear corners of your formation to counter any flanking cavalry and hold that line, but in the center, consider 1 or 2 units of swordsmen because they will outgrind the infantry.
Just a quick reminder guys, if you are enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, it really helps out. Ask any question in the comments, I answer everything, and if you'd like to talk strategy, feel free to join the Discord. Cheers.
Next up, a unit that has certainly moved up a grade, and that is the halberdier. Beforehand, they needed an armory building in addition to a barracks, so 2 buildings to build a single unit, and they absolutely did not justify that expense in my mind, but they are now significantly better, only needing a barracks. They do come with a notably higher price tag, so they don't replace your shielded spearmen as your default defensive infantryman. The reason being is that shield blocking 1/3 of all projectiles is incredibly useful, and shielded spearmen are just far more cost effective. However, there are cases where the halberdier is the default go-to. If you are versing Chaos Warriors, they have armor piercing. Against their heavily armored Chaos Warriors, that is a fight they are going to lose and get ground down. However, your trusty halberdiers boast the same melee defense, so they hold the line, but they hit a little bit harder and more often with armor piercing halberds, so they are going to give as good as they get. The same goes when versing vampire counts. You often won't have the money, but if you need to build a crisis army and have the choice of infantry unit, these are the best to use because both of those factions don't have any missile units, so your shield is useless, so you may as well double down on making that front line deal some damage back. One of the biggest challenges you'll have with the Empire is versing other factions and races which have better, more trained basic infantry than you do, so you need to invest in them. Either skill points, consider placing 1 point in your basic infantry to give a +4 melee defense, and 2 points will also give +4 melee attack. At least with your starting lord, I personally find this has amazing mileage, particularly on the harder difficulties. However, even if you don't go this way, I cannot recommend enough putting the first 2 researchers into your melee infantry, bolstering their melee attack and melee defense across your entire empire. Even a garrison that is attacked will have its infantry gain this bonus. Many players go straight for the gunpowder and artillery upgrades, but these units are already good. Your infantry are the ones that have been rushed to the line, and they need the love. Put a little bit of faith and time in them to give them the equipment and training they need, and they will hold the line long enough to let those damage dealers do their job. In my most recent Karl Franz video, we win the game at turn 30, utilizing these buffs to melee infantry to allow our basic army to achieve much greater. Next up, we have the only offensive infantryman within the first 2 tiers of the Empire roster, the Free Company Militia. Attached to Volkmar's DLC, this is a very good and very well-rounded unit, but keep in mind it is best used in a couple of ways. Make sure you deploy it very slightly behind your front line so it can unleash volleys of its pistols, because it will do a surprising amount of damage. Every model inside of the unit can shoot, meaning you get a lot of saturation. Their flintlock pistols only fire small bullets, and they only do 2 armor-piercing damage, so they're more comparable to arrows. However, they do have 2 penetration, so when these guys are blasting through units which don't have shields on the approach, or you pivot them to shred the rear of a unit that's engaged in combat, you will get a lot of damage, allowing them to use most of their ammunition and then having them charge in. But keep in mind they're not quite as well equipped as an Empire swordsman, and you'll need to cycle them out again. Some people even spam these to excellent effect. I would recommend place a couple of these in between. Give these guys some gaps for line of sight and watch them chip away at the enemy health. They require awesome execution, but they are a solid B tier unit. And speaking of units that can be spammed for great effect, are the Empire Archer attached to the Hunter and Beast DLC, and boy do I not like this unit. Yes, if you're trying to min-max, you can do some good stuff with it. However, this unit is such a trap. People get attracted to it because it is so cheap and a missile unit, but it only has 2 armor piercing. Your main army should be comprised by units that you want to build up, gain levels on, and become a solid fighting force. This might just be my own philosophy, but I do not like using units that I'm just going to have to dismiss later. Their short range and very low damage means as soon as you come to the tier 3, tier 4, they are just a liability. I go entire campaigns without ever hiring this unit. The only exception is in a crisis. This is pretty good to have. The garrisons usually have a good core of melee troops, so a couple of extra missile units to volley over the top, but if there's a barracks nearby, hire anything else instead. Cost effective is all they are, and they are well below what an archer should be and not worth the investment in your armies. This unit is immediately surpassed by our next entry, the Empire Crossbowmen, and this is worth your time. Crossbowmen are so fundamentally important because as the Empire, you will find yourself often outnumbered by hordes of undead zombies, swaths of goblins with spears. You will really need to whittle down the numbers to not get overwhelmed, so having the crossbow bolts that launch over your front line, dealing damage to these blobs, is just so powerful and is something that you should use in tandem with gunpowder, not instead of. But these used to be your bread and butter as the Empire because it was so much more difficult to get gunpowder on the field, and they have really fixed that with this latest patch, so you don't depend on crossbowmen quite as much as you used to. And that's kind of good, but they still prove useful because they can volley over the front row of infantry that are protecting them, meaning they still get a lot of value. At least in the early to mid games, you want 3 of these minimum. You could roll as high as 6, even 9, but I really don't recommend that far because you have gunpowder units and more heroes to buff those units now. It's a solid unit that you'll use in every single playthrough, and instead of getting archers, just hold off and get these instead. They will not let you down. Before we move on, let's just touch on the state troops. This is very much focused around Karl Franz. You can pay for these units to unlock them with the other factions, but honestly it's not really worth it. They've got their own buffs and abilities that are better suited to them, and better that they focus on those. However, Karl Franz, if you've seen my Empire guides, the strongest play is to capture Marienburg first, but after that, Boris Todbringer, confederate him and get control of Middenland. Placing an elector in that seat will unlock the Swords of Ulrich. Incredible for a tier 1 unit, but there is just so much tier 3, tier 4 that will just beat it up, so it stays here. However, it does have Frenzy, gaining +10 melee attack while bolstering its offense by 10%, and this unit also has Fear, whilst itself also having immunity to psychology. So vampires, big creatures, nothing is going to scare it off, so it's going to stand there and outgrind units with better stats. After Midland, or even before, gaining Elspeth under your control, so long as you have the DLC, will usually get her capital of none, but also she will usually control Solent, and that capital will unlock the Eldred's Guard. And you should aim to recruit it every chance you get. It is that good. A unit this early with 70 armor has 60% chance to block any missiles that come its way. Unlike regular spearmen, which only have charge defense versus large, it gains expert charge defense, which means the 13-second bonus for charging into the enemy is completely nullified. This is the best defensive infantryman in the entire Empire roster, and it's not even close, topped off by the encourage ability, bolstering the leadership of nearby troops. As Karl Franz, both of those are provinces you should aim to get under your control fairly early. However, one I would certainly hold off is Nordland up the top. The reason being is this will make you in control of having to repel all the Norscan raids that come your way. I do not like dealing with Norska. I will gift as much land up there back to Nordland as possible so they can deal with those problems. But if you do take the capital, you will gain the Nordland Mariners, and they are a better halberdier. They never get tired, so that's actually quite good. But unlike the Eldred Guard, which I would prioritize because they are so good, you can really live without this one. And finally, for the infantry, we have the Stir River Crossbowmen. Whilst it might take you a while to get Stirland, the state troop is an A tier unit because it has suppress, so it slows the enemy speed by a third. Now, since you're trying to delay the enemy coming towards your gunpowder units, this buys them a bit more time to shred as well as deal flaming damage, meaning it will do extra damage versus vampires. You don't need to rush this unit, but man, it makes every Empire formation just a bit better. To assist with these large volumes of units is the Mortars, and this is a unit that every single army in the early game could benefit from having at least one of in, if not two. Well, with your secondary armies, this will give you a siege attacker, meaning you can attack on the same turn, and they perform very well in sieges. Smash through the walls, blob up the enemy, and then blow them to pieces with this and any magic you have on hand, because other than magic, this is your best way of dealing with large groups of enemy units. Don't spam it, 1 or 2 is more than enough, but it is a great tool in the early game versus the enemies you're likely to fight. The State Troop version you think would be S tier because it deals magic damage, so it pierces right through any physical resistance they have, but it does no friendly fire. That's right, everyone listening to this at some point is responsible for blowing away some good men of the Empire accidentally because of 1 or 2 misplaced mortar shots or hellstorms. We'll get to that later, but this completely nullifies that. However, once you start reaching the mid game, you gain better pieces of artillery, better armor, just better ways to deal damage than this. And whilst not having to worry about friendly fire is nice, it's typically not the thing that's going to win those very hard battles. Next, almost flirting with S tier legendary, is the iconic Empire Handgunner. So how can we place this so high? Well, the reason is as a tier 2 unit, it is now absolutely incredible by virtue of its upkeep and not needing several buildings to be recruited. It is so convenient. The gunsmith will now unlock additional witch hunters, so there is incentive to have this building everywhere. This really is the most default style handgun unit you could possibly get, but it is just so damn dependable. So we've established shielded spearmen, hold that front line, crossbows and mortars volley over into the enemy blobs to thin the numbers, but against enemy heroes and characters, gunpowder is the best tool, allowing you to focus down and snipe enemy characters, which are the biggest threat, and against the vampires, all their strength is centered around their powerful characters. So in any Empire army, you want at least 4 gunpowder units situated somewhere. You can go as high as 6 or even 8. See my formations videos, go 2 hollow diamonds, each with 3 handgunners, and then a unit of crossbowmen behind that can volley over. Understanding how to set your units up will be key in getting the payoff with gunpowder units. They are incredibly satisfying to use, but you need to set up your formations to provide them with the opportunity. I'm sure plenty out there would put them in S tier because they are that damn reliable, and if that was reliable, then yes they would, but we've got a very high bar for that S tier, so it just slips down to A tier. Gunpowder is also essential when taking down Festus or any other armored enemies, because heavy armor will just glance those bow bolts off and they won't do anywhere near enough damage. Make sure you bring some handgunners up to Hochland, remove the Nurgle forces from there, and then capture the seat of Hergig. This unlocks the Gundam and Surefires, the State Troop version of the handgunners, and boy are they good, they're so good. Extended range up to 160, and they also have stalk, so they're invisible until the enemy is about 170 feet away, so basically as soon as they're discovered, they are in range and they can start unleashing hell. Of all the Empire gun units, they are the most accurate. They have plus 10 accuracy, increased melee stats, but still, just like the rest of these range units, you do not want them in melee, they will get beaten up. Make sure your spears are well organized. Now we're going to do a quick deep dive on, I think, a question a lot of people have been asking, which is what is the difference between all of the Empire gunpowder units? We now have the handgunner. They have 120 men in each formation. Their bullets do not penetrate any targets and they have a range of 140, so they are going to spray through and damage armored threats on approach. A gunsmith up to tier 3 will unlock the newest additions, the Null and Ironside and the Hochland long rifles. So let's establish the long rifles first. They're the easy ones. They are essentially a medieval sniper. To understand this, there's 2 hidden mechanics we need to discuss. The most important being calibration distance. Handgunners have a range of 145, but their calibration distance is only 100, so their accuracy is significantly higher when within that last 100 meters. Their nearest competition is the tier 3 Null and Ironside, which also has a range of 145. However, their calibration distance is 135. With a smaller calibration area, their bullets deviate far less. This means against single entities or concentrated units of elite infantry, the Null and Ironside will hit way harder and way more often. Particularly against heroes, that accuracy is devastating, allowing them to hit units that you would typically need to slow. Their unit size is only 60 versus the handgun's 90. However, the Null Iron Sight's bullets can pierce 2 enemies, whereas the handgunners can't pierce any. So here you can see the Null Iron Sights are far better suited at focusing down an elite unit and can protect themselves much better in melee. However, for their price, handgunners really are unrivaled. So yes, whilst you could consider Null Iron Sights as an upgrade, I would add a few to an army with some handgunners rather than replace them completely to manage your costs. The Hochland long rifles have a devastating range of 260, again only 60 men in the unit, and they can penetrate 1 character. With heavy armor piercing damage, they're great for softening the enemy up on approach. If you can start them in some trees, they do have snipes so they can hide, but their primary purpose is to blast down the enemy heavy infantry. A cool unit, well suited for gun lines, but I wouldn't bring more than 3 in any army. If you're playing with Elspeth von Draken directly, you gain access to her unique Amethyst units, which essentially combine the specialty gunpowder of Nuln, which can fire literal death magic. It is pretty damn cool, very powerful, and sits firmly in the realm of S tier legendary. Their magical damage will shred absolutely everything, anywhere, and they've actually got pretty good defensive stats, so if you wanted to try to field nothing but gunpowder in her army, this is the way to do it. Now, we haven't spoken about the stable yet, but if you do, at tier 1 you can get Pistoliers, and this unit can actually be quite useful. It's under B tier solid. If they have War Dogs, Fellbats, you can run these guys up, bait them out, shoot them, annoy them, and then run them back to the army, allowing the army to take them apart. You'll often be at a numeric disadvantage, and this allows you to break the enemy up piecemeal. They can also get behind the enemy, and once they've run out of ammo, they can also cycle charge, but their stats are terrible. Hold Alt and right click to charge them in, and immediately bring them out. It's often a case of breaking the enemy with a charge rather than dealing damage. Instead, draw a line along the enemy flank, and allow them free shots into the enemy's backs where their shields can't save them. This unit stops being useful very early, and they'll end up running away more than they stand and fight. The State Troop version is also very cool and can actually replenish its ammunition. Its melee stats are much better, so whilst those shots are replenishing, you can get some rear charges in to help break some enemies that are barely holding on, but once again, it is so lightly armored, it will often be running away from more enemies than it wants to engage with. Next we have Outriders. They can't shoot backwards like Pistoliers can, but line them up and allow them to deal some serious armor piercing damage. The Pistoliers, similar to the Free Company, are only using small pistols, so they're not really dealing damage against the most threatening enemies. However, Outriders can. The problem is the weapon is two-handed, so they need to stay still in order to fire and fire forward, so they're much more finicky to use. They can be useful, but similar to Pistoliers, you can often find them running away, struggling for opportunity. If you are going to bring them, I personally find they work best in pairs, but they are outclassed by the grenade version, just like so many other units are. This unit is fantastic because it addresses many of the shortcomings the Empire have in the early game. Whilst your main infantry, spears, and gunline formation is relatively static, this gives you a fast, nimble moving arm that can bait the enemy out, vanguard deploy, blast shots to soften up the enemy infantry, and once they're engaged with your front line, wheel around and unleash devastating volleys into the enemy's back. I like to run these in pairs, but you don't need any more than that. But the State Troop variant is one of the best units in the entire roster, and I would even argue the game. The Borderman Grenade Outriders. These are such a powerful unit. Capture Marienburg first and get yourself one of these. Use Carl's ability to get 2 in the first 10 turns of the game, and these are the answer to all of the enemy chaff that you cannot possibly clear. Right up ahead, blast the enemy to pieces. These are your MVPs in the early game as Karl Franz, and I cannot overstate just how good they are. S tier, legendary, absolutely love them. Elspeth also gets an Amethyst version, and as you'd expect, it's glorious with death magic galore. It has insane range, does insane damage, and is worthy of S tier for all those good Outrider reasons. Next up, we have a unit that's had a very hard time over the years, and guess what? It's going to get a hard time from me once again, and it is the War Wagon. It just fits in such an odd groove. It's not as fast and nimble as Pistoliers, so it's not as evasive. It has 60 speed, so it can out-kite enemy infantry, and it's basically a wagon filled with handgunners shooting down from above, but it just isn't quick enough. 60 speed is enough to kite infantry, but you have tools to deal with infantry. Its biggest sin is it doesn't have a heavy charge and doesn't deal armor piercing damage in melee because, well, it's just a couple of horses. Good chariot units aren't afraid to barge through the enemy lines, but this one kind of is. It's just running around playing scared, trying not to get caught, but it does deal some very heavy armor piercing damage. So if you're a micro god, you can make this do some great things, but otherwise I don't think it's worth the mental energy or investment. And only not landing in D outperform because I'm feeling nice is the war wagon with the mortar attached. It's basically a mobile mortar, and I guess that gives it a bit more flexibility, but man, you just really don't need this unit. You have such a good defensive core when all your units are working in tandem, and you have this thing wandering off doing its own thing. War wagons are not terrible units, they just do not fit into the game plan conducive with the Empire's success. If you want a mortar, get a mortar. If you want gunpowder, use one of these excellent A-tier gunpowder units, and if you want a chariot, instead use the Empire's excellent heavy cavalry. Next up at the bottom of B tier, we have the cannon. It's not a replacement for the mortar. It deals a long, straight, direct line of damage to an enemy, usually like a large unit or a single entity, which you don't really see at this stage of the game. However, they do have a use, and that use is taking out enemy towers during sieges. Those towers will absolutely ravage your units, but castle up against one side, blast the towers down. With your great cannon, you can usually take down a couple of them, and this will allow you to move up, not lose half your troops, and take the enemy settlement at your own pace. Not a unit I typically find myself hiring, but it does have a use. This struggle for relevancy is also felt by the Huntsman. Him and the Archer are very powerful under Marcus Wolfhard in his army, and you should absolutely feel those in his army. But outside of that, this is an Archer which has anti-large, so he's designed to shoot down big game. The problem is that you have some of the best gunpowder in the game for its price, so why would you ever hire this guy? Good under Marcus, outperformed with everyone else. There is only one F-tier banished unit in this entire roster, and it is of course the Flagellant. Yes, he does get some buffs with Volkmar, but they are not worth it. So they do have Unbreakable, and for tier 2 they've got some decent chops in melee, but they have poor armor, they are going to be hard to keep alive because they don't rat, and sometimes having units rat is actually useful because you don't have to keep on guarding them and manually pulling them out, which you are sometimes too overwhelmed for in really tough battles. This unit is definitely better in multiplayer, and with its bonuses when it engages in combat is a little bit better than I'm making it sound here, but it's just not something that's going to last in your campaigns. You could maybe justify hiring them in a crisis as better than a regular spearman, but outside of that, I would never ever hire Flagellants. They're just awful. A much better unit, but one that still struggles for relevancy, is the Empire Greatsword. He's worked his way up in society, he's got himself a big sword, a big set of armor, and out to prove himself. Now on the surface of it, this is a pretty damn good unit. 30 melee attack and melee defense with 14 bonus infantry. They are hitting all tier 3 and below infantry and dealing some solid armor piercing damage. So, well, what's the catch? Well, the thing is they're heavily armored and they're slow on foot, and in some armies that works great. But the Empire are built around a stable front line and formation, with heavy cavalry doing the mobile charging, and that's what an offensive infantry unit should be doing, is charging into the enemy flanks. Now, would you still hire this? Well, absolutely you would. Late game, if you have a tier 3 barracks and you're about to be swarmed by some heavy armor like Chaos or Black Orcs, then absolutely get this unit. It's going to do very well on the front line. She'll give a beating and really chop up enemy infantry, but this probably isn't the biggest risk to you at this point in the game. Your biggest risk will be larger units. This will be an overly expensive tool when compared to the others at your disposal, particularly your amazing gunpowder units at removing heavy armor. Karl Franz, however, does start with a very impressive state troop version. This unit is fearless and gives a +5 melee attack and a leadership buff to all units that surround it, meaning this is an incredible unit to have front and center in your formation, bolstering the melee units around it, and this will stack with the other buffs that are passed on by your heroes. The fact it's fearless means she'll fight to the death, which is a good thing, but just keep one eye on their health bar. As soon as they whittle down to maybe 10 or less troops, pull them back and let them survive the encounter, because if they live long enough to get some experience on them, they will do very well, and in Karl Franz's army, having a front line of 3 of these is absolutely glorious, because his buffs make them absolutely beastie. Well, at the end of the day, the Greatsword needs to compare against the mighty Empire Knights. If you are anyone in the society, you are riding upon a horseback as an Imperial Knight boasting 110 armor, and they carry a shield with 30% chance to block. The only catch is their armor piercing isn't great, but they are designed to cycle charge. Remember, shock cavalry isn't designed always to do damage, it is to break the enemy and their morale. Smash enemy in the rear, pull them out after 10 seconds, and then do it again to another unit, trying to ruin their morale because they take a massive penalty when being charged from all sides. Remember, you lose a third of melee defense from the side and then 2/3 from the rear. By cycle charging, you can do incredible damage, but because they're also so tanky, anytime a unit's about to get within your lines, hunt down your gun units, just charge these guys into them, pin them in place and tie them up, and they will be able to hang the hell of a long time, especially for a tier 2 unit, and they belong proudly in the A tier. With tier 2 complete, we're moving on to the tier 3 knights, with the Knights of the Blazing Sun, and boy do they pack an absolute punch when they charge. The best charge bonus out of any of the Empire units. However, their lack of armor piercing and lack of staying power really does limit what they can do. But is that charge bonus really going to be decisive at this stage of the game? Their main draw is the fact they deliver fire damage, and flaming damage will prevent the regeneration of undead units. This unit needs to be viewed more as an anti-undead tool than a unit in its own right, however it will lack utility after this point. If they're available and I have a vampire stack coming my way, a couple in the army will go a very long way, but outside of this, these are just outclassed by the less niche cavalry options. Next we have the true heavyweights of the Empire Heavy Cavalry, Knights of the Black Rose, and the Reiksguard. Reiksguard can be buffed incredibly in Karl Franz's army, gaining anti-large as well as other buffs. Already a great unit, bolstered even more if you can build his chapter house. Building Castle Reiksguard in the capital provides a 5% upkeep reduction to all cavalry as well as devastating flanker for Reiksguard. How devastating, you ask? Well, it doubles the charge bonus when attacking the rear or flank, which is just bananas. That's 132. That's just absolutely insane. Telebachland bolsters the Knights of the Flaming Sun. At Wissenland, the Black Rose chapter house makes Knights of the Black Rose absolutely beastie. The Iron Resolve ability means that their models can't fall until the entire unit's health is depleted beyond halfway, meaning the staying power is greatly improved, and the staying power is already bloody impressive. We've established the Reiksguard are a heavy cavalry designed to plow through, deal damage, and then move to the next engagement. But if out in the open, the Knights of the Black Rose can pin the enemy in place and can actually stand and fight with their 50 melee defense, which is just astronomically good for a cavalry unit. Benefiting from a small anti-infantry bonus, this unit can absolutely stay and hang, allowing the Reiksguard to move into the rear and then shatter the enemy, meaning these two variants of cavalry can work together rather than compete with each other. You only need 1 or 2 units of each in any army, but boy are they fun, especially when you get the chapter house buffs. The only catch is both these variants don't deal that much armor piercing, but they have 120 armor and will block 30% of projectiles from the front. Now, because the two variants have a similar dynamic to the Reiksguard and the Knights of the Black Rose, we're going to talk about the vaunted Demi-Griff Knights. These are your armor-piercing answer to late-game threats. They have a regular lance version, as well as a halberdier version. Now, the halberdier version has anti-large, whilst the lance version boasts better stats overall, and is better for holding the line against the enemy. You don't necessarily need these, but they can be very potent and add a lot of flexibility to your builds. They're a majestic and powerful unit, but I recommend playing them relatively defensively. Don't leave them out in the open where they can get peppered by arrows. Bring them out as a heavy reserve force and trash the enemy decisively. In the front corners, I like to have 2 of the lance variant and then 2 of the halberd variant behind them guarding the rear. Anything that comes through, the halberd variant can tear any beasts or monsters that want to harass your back line apart. Make sure you put them in Theodore Bruckner's army. They gain a few nice buffs. There's no need to go overboard on them, but consider having a couple in your armies because the halberd version in particular can deliver some big anti-large damage to where you need it desperately. Now to cover the state troop cavalry units in the form of just basically Empire Knight variants. All are essentially better than the Empire Knight, but these are usually in more of the eastern Elector Count counties, so you're not likely to get access to these until late in the game, and honestly, none of them are really worth chasing down. The game is nice and lets you gain access to the best ones relatively early, but when you get access to these, you may as well hire them. They are certainly still very strong and dependable, starting with, well, what I've used the least best, which is the Knights of More. They cause fear, cause terror, and provide protection from psychology from the nearby units, so it's not really that useful. It's got the same armor and shield as Raksguard, so there is that. Overall, a unit that you wouldn't really notice if you missed it. However, the Knights of the Everlasting Light look very similar, but they are a little bit better. Almost the exact same in terms of stats, but also dealing magic damage, meaning they can slice right through any physical resistance the enemy may have, which when you eventually fight demons can be quite useful if nothing else. Both these variants do lack armor piercing, so you will notice that. However, there is the added bonus with the Knights of the Everlasting Light, having the Hex blinding the enemy, lowering their melee attack by 8. Very nice to have on the front lines. If there's a unit that's in trouble, cycle charge the enemy they're fighting and debuff them at the same time. Very fun, very nice. The final state troop knights are the Stubborn Bulls, essentially greatsword wielding Empire Knights, and it is as awesome as it sounds. I think that would be relatively hard to do, and as a result their charge bonus isn't that good, but they do bring armor piercing to a cavalry unit, something you would need to get Demigryph Knights in order to do. So whilst they don't carry a shield, they are able to deal armor piercing damage back to higher level enemies, and you will fight those eventually, giving them an A tier overall. If you want to focus one province into mass producing cavalry, consider building the paved roads and the toll gates, which will reduce your local and global recruitment, getting around that 2-turn recruitment time. Moving on to heroes, and I am so stoked to say that the Empire Captain has moved up into A tier, and you're probably wondering how. Well, my biggest complaint of the Empire beforehand is their heroes and characters did not bring enough means to improve the stats and improve the leadership of the Empire soldiery. See, I've done an excellent job of revamping the heroes at the Empire's disposal, allowing them to punch a bit higher, allowing you to field a cohesive unit that is greater than the sum of its parts, which really is what the Empire's about, and I absolutely love it. Riding on top of a horse or a flying Pegasus, take your pick, he serves as a decent frontliner, but like all Empire troops, can be trained to be awesome, and now with the expansion of his skill tree, he gains Guardian, an extra 15% melee defense, an extra 15% physical resistance, improved stats, and most of all, the ability to either buff infantry or cavalry of the entire army. And man, I'm glad they got this. This alone makes it worth bringing a captain in either an infantry or a cavalry oriented army. In most cases, you'll probably want to bolster the defensive stats of your infantry, but feel free to have a reinforcing army that's quite heavy in cavalry, so when they storm onto the field, he can fly ahead with them, bolstering their stats. You can have a general on an Imperial Griffin, or even an Archlector using his auras to buff those troops and wreck what's left of the enemy in one decisive cavalry charge. It's fun and it's glorious. Another very forgetful unit previously that's been buffed up to A tier is the Witch Hunter, and whilst this guy isn't the greatest hero around, he certainly is worthy of an A tier. More buffs to deal more damage, is more defensible, and now has area of effect buffs enhancing the melee combat abilities of his nearby soldiers. Quite similar to the Archlector, but instead of actually fighting on the front line, you might want him sitting back between two units, targeting enemy characters with his flintlock pistol. As he levels up, he can choose a few unique abilities. I find the ambush defense hard to say no to. Next up, keeping the faith in the Empire, we have the Warrior Priest. Whilst I'm not too heavy with them, some people absolutely love this unit and use it in really high volume and basically take advantage of the incredible melee buffs, the increased ward save. He's just able to project so much support so reliably, throw him on top of a horse and he can easily run down and rally, raise his hammer and get those troops to fight a little bit harder and a little bit longer. Not to mention, outside of battle, replenishment is absolutely key. You'll have to fight a lot, and this will allow you to fight a lot more consistently. And to top it all off, having a bombardment spell which doesn't target friendly units, you can just blob up and dump it down so reliably. This guy is a mainstay. He'll hold the line, help everyone else do the same. Absolutely love it. If you have a minor settlement with a tier 3 slot and don't know what to do with it, you can't go too wrong with getting another Warrior Priest. The newest addition to the heroes is the Engineer, attached to the Thrones of Decay DLC, and man, this guy is just excellent. Being able to increase the missile damage of every unit inside of your army, you cannot overlook this, and this should 100% be the priority you get. He can sit back and unload with some good armor piercing shots, meaning he's quite suited to taking down single entities, as all gunpowder units are. So he's great at taking down single units, he's great at buffing all of the missile damage of your entire army, has some useful abilities. S tier, legendary, make sure you get one. Whilst the Captain and Witch Hunter will make a good army even better, you really shouldn't leave home without these two, providing the replenishment, frontline support, and extra missile damage, which really characterizes the Empire. It'll take a while, but the Great Cult at Midland will increase your recruit rank of your Witch Hunters and your Warrior Priests. As for legendary heroes, of course the Empire can gain access to Gotrek and Felix, as all the Order-Tide can, as well as Ulrika. Simply build a tier 3 walls at any capital and you will unlock her, but unique only to the Empire is Theodore Bruckner. At first glance he doesn't seem that impressive, but man, this guy gets awesome buffs that you can just keep on stacking on and stacking on. He buffs Demigryph Knights, and man, a great frontliner, you can't ask for more than that. And finally, the hero with the most damage potential, of course it is going to be the Wizard. You have 8 Laws of Magic, they're all excellent. The most recent rework gave the Empire Wizards a new lease on life, gaining way more buffs, reduction in spell cost, several high tier abilities, and some very specific to unique Laws of Magic. Fire magic with Burning Head is incredibly powerful at crowd control against the undead. As you approach the mid to late game, light magic, very good with Net of Amantok. Overcast that by clicking on it twice and pin several units in place and leave them as fodder for your artillery. Life magic is always a great staple, with Awakening of the Woods, Dwellers Below dealing great area of effect damage, but most of all, using Earthblood to keep your heroes and characters all healed up between each battle, it's absolutely priceless. I don't find myself using life magic that much with the Empire, but I still acknowledge it is a top tier Law of Magic and can synergize very well with the Empire, and also even the Law of Heavens can be very useful with the Empire. When facing Chaos, the Law of Metal has its uses. Armor piercing damage and casting Plague of Rust to diminish the enemy armor will help your gunpowder shred even harder. The Beast Wizard is also a fan favorite. He gets to ride on top of an Imperial Griffin, making him the most sturdy, as well as his ability to summon down Hawks as a temporary summon is pretty damn cool. When playing as Balthazar Gelt, his Colleges of Magic allows you to temporarily enhance your wizards with all sorts of powers, including the Cataclysm spells, which is absolute nonsense and turns them into near demigods for as long as that ability is active. So overall, excellent progress for the Empire. They had a few mid characters and they've all been moved up to A tier or above, so great job CA. Now to move on to the War Machines. Starting off with the Landship, it has a lot of firepower, can move around, and the fact it is more mobile does give you a bit of tactical flexibility. There's a few ways you can play the Empire. You can be more static with an infantry-centered formation, or you can have your artillery being more defended with, say, Demigryph Knights, and a more flexible mobile combination. And this is where I find the Landship is most useful. Yes, it's more micro-intensive, but being able to weave the enemy and pin them in place can deny the enemy a ton of opportunity, and you can do a lot of battles without taking a lot of damage. However, this is very, very micro-intensive, and you can still have it sitting back and just blasting away. It's not that nimble. It can play through the enemy and use an ability to increase its speed should it so need. Whilst some War Machines have no chance of fighting back, at least this has troops on top unloading ammunition into anything that gets too close. The Amethyst Landship is essentially the same thing with just a few more tricks and whistles. Insane damage, very good, and absolutely worth the high price you pay for it. Now to the artillery, the iconic duo of the Hellstorm Rocket Battery and the Hellblaster Volley Gun. So first of all, the Hellstorm, literally a barrage of missiles which just decimates a blob of anything that it's aiming at. Now these missiles can be dodged over a distance and you'll find that the enemy just doesn't walk blindly before you like it used to, but it is still an incredibly potent tool. The fact the enemy scatters can actually be very useful. Target their most dangerous ranged units and they will be left behind whilst the rest of the army charges forward, whilst they cover up and try to run for their lives. Its devastating range means you can easily target the enemy artillery and will almost always win in a trade of attrition. But where it really shines is in sieges. Hold Alt to manually fire over the gates and blast troops to smithereens. Man, it is just, I don't know, I have way too much fun doing this, but it's incredibly potent and you can soften up the enemy and take out their high value units, blowing up the entire barricade they're standing on. It's just too much fun. Once they get too close, be careful with friendly fire and give it targets that are not engaged with yours because they will literally blow yours to pieces trying to get to the enemy. So don't field more than 2 of these. I find 2 works really well. I wouldn't even try 3. Just go 1 or even 2. You'll get your money back on them. But the Hellblaster Volley Gun, on the other hand, essentially 3 midi guns, the epitome of just high caliber firepower in the Warhammer world. This absolutely shreds anything that it's aiming at. Single entities, characters, or high value targets are what this is good at, and boy is it accurate. use your engineer's ballistics calibration to make them even more accurate, and the big single entities that would typically threaten your formations get absolutely shredded. The worst thing that can happen is having big single entities come through and just demolish your formations. Because your gunpowder units have less range, that you often can't do anything about it till they get closer. This gives you an extended range and the ability to deal with big threats before they come in, giving you more options later in the battle. In my formations video, I used 2 Hellstorm rocket batteries at the back with 3 Hellblasters in front of those, and I found that was able to handle just about anything. Elspeth von Draken gets an amethyst version of this, and I absolutely love it. It's the same Hellstorm rocket battery that you know and love, except every missile that lands explodes into several mini purple suns that will help fry the enemy. Typical of Elspeth, combining elite engineering with dark magic. Just so good and so much fun. Next up, we have the steam tanks, the main version having a traditional turret, and it sits in A tier, with the brand new Hellblaster variant taking the S tier. And honestly, they're both very good, but in the late game, steam tanks really can provide an excellent front line and a great buffer to allow your gunpowder and artillery units to work. The fact you will want the tanks closer means the Hellblaster is just the perfect weapon for the job. However, the regular version does get a State Troop variant, and it's absolutely S tier, hitting just a little bit harder, but also a unique ability that allows it to expel steam out and just burn the hell out of anyone that is surrounding it. Just be warned, Karl Franz should get access to this quite quickly because you will confederate Elspeth relatively early in the campaign. Just be aware of the upkeep cost. In the early to mid game, don't spam mid to high tier units. Complement your existing armies with them so you don't go broke. Yes, getting a tank at turn 10 can be very cool, but I would wait a few more turns to get it.
Now, a unit that's not easy to use is the Luminarch. Oh my god, this thing is just... It takes 20 minutes to fire a shot, and if that shot lands, it does insane damage, but it is so unpredictable, so situational, and so matchup dependent. Balthazar Gelt gives 20% extra damage on these, so they perform definitely at a B tier, but I wouldn't be surprised if many people demanded that these go in D tier outperform, because even the terrain of the map can severely limit what these things can do. Just to show that I'm not exaggerating this is Balthazar Gelt, and he is the best user of the Luminarch, and even he, it's okay, you can get nearly 2,000 damage per shot, but it takes 14 seconds to reload the damn thing. Every unit in an Empire army needs to contribute to the overall goal, and you don't really have room for this kind of unpredictability.
Finally, we have the Super Best Friends Club of Marcus Wolfhart. His companions are all pretty damn cool. Herdwick the Witch Hunter will give you bonuses versing undead in this army, so yeah, he's nice to have around, but he's probably the least inspired of the lot. Roderick is forgettable, except he has the amazing ability to boost faction-wide post-battle loot and sacking revenue by 5%. So, always worth it. Kalara the Wood Elf will improve the campaign movement of the entire army, as well as gaining Eye of Kernus, further bolstering your ranged units, as well as she is an absolute beast and very hard to hit in melee. Jorek Grimm is a Dwarven Engineer that brings everything a great Dwarven Engineer does. Improve mobility, he'll punch you in the face if you get too close, flash bombs to slow the enemy, he just synergizes really nicely and can improve the missile damage of Marcus Wolfhart's armies very great, and with all these guys you can confederate them like you see here into the mid or late game once you get eyes on him, but I would first gain control over Reichland, send a hero down, and then discover Marcus Wolfhart and then confederate him. If you start with Volkmar, same deal, just sail a hero over. If you begin with Gelt, just sail a hero through the ship lanes and then you'll discover him shortly after. Don't do this any earlier than turn 30 and ensure that you get all the heroes. And that's the list. Thank you so much for everyone that's been waiting. Please detail any responses below. Please tell me what you think if you have a different take, but try to point me in the direction of the skills or the numbers so I can get an idea as to what you're thinking, rather than this is good or bad. What is it good against and what is it bad against? The more views we get, the more rounded opinions we get. But thank you for taking part. I do take longer to make some videos, but I promise I do put a lot of work into them, and hopefully it's worth your time. So please consider liking and subbing. Discord is free. This is Elv, and I'll see you later. Cheers.